Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is a challenge facing the world. It is to seal the deal on combating climate change at the UNFCCC meeting in Copenhagen this December. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its last report, considered that the 2-degree rise in temperature that marks dangerous climate change would be triggered by a CO2 emissions concentration level of 450 parts per million. Many of us now believe that figure to be hopelessly optimistic and consider a concentration level of 380 parts per million or even 350 to be more in keeping with the latest science. Notwithstanding that, I will, for the purpose of this debate, use the 450 figure. To stay within that 450 ppm target, the world must curb its projected greenhouse gas emissions by 17 gigatons per annum by 2020. But by 2050, the total emissions each year from the entire global population must be no more than 20 gigatons in total if we are to stabilize the climate within that 2-degree dangerous climate margin. That is a huge mitigation challenge. A reduction calculated of at least 47 gigatons from a business-as-usual scenario. Globally, biofuels and biomass could play an important role in meeting these mitigation targets. And nationally, the UK Renewable Energy Strategy, published earlier this year, has indicated that approximately 30% of the UK's renewable energy target could come from bioenergy for heat and power, up to 50% if biofuel for transport is included. That target is for 15% of our energy to come from renewables by 2020. This means that in the next decade, we should see the UK growing 4.5% of its heat and power. In 2006, Peter Kendall, the president of the NFU, argued that British farmers are uniquely well placed to deliver the renewable transport fuel obligation in a sustainable manner, thanks to the widespread adoption of farm assurance schemes. He stated that, and I quote, "developed in a sustainable way, in the context of a wide-ranging strategy for alternative crops, biofuels offers society a win-win-win solution." Part of this win for farmers is the £47 million subsidy that the government provides through the Rural Development Programme, where payments of 40% of actual establishment costs of energy crops are made to encourage farmers to plant for energy. Here is where farmers need to gauge relative reward, however, and certainly the higher price of wheat, even from lower yields on poor quality land, has not encouraged farmers to switch from traditional food crops as fast as the government would have wished. And this has prompted the government to decide to increase those planting grants from 40 to 50% of the actual establishment costs in England from 2010. But subsidy is a two-edged sword. It should be used to tackle market failure. It should not be used as market manipulation for protection of domestic interests. And the World Bank report last year, entitled Biofuels, the Promise and the Risks, highlighted the effects of different governments around the world's support for biofuels. This is what it said. I quote, "Governments provide substantial support to biofuels so that they can compete with gasoline and conventional diesel. Such support includes consumption incentives, fuel tax reductions, production incentives, tax incentives, loan guarantees and direct subsidy payments, and mandatory consumption requirements. More than 200 support measures which cost around 5.5 to 7.3 billion US dollars a year in the United States amounted to a 38 to 49 cents per litre of petroleum equivalent for ethanol. Even in Brazil, sustained government support through direct subsidies was required until recently to develop a competitive industry. Domestic producers in the European Union and the United States receive additional support through high import tariffs on ethanol. Biofuel production has pushed up feedstock prices. The clearest example is maize, whose price rose by over 60% from 2005 to 2007, largely because of the US ethanol program combined with reduced stocks in major exporting countries. What subsidy does, Mr. Speaker, is drive land use change, and the effects of that can be considerably more than tortilla riots in Mexico, as we've seen, and food price spikes on the world market. Land use change that replaces biodiversity with monoculture can do incalculable damage to the ecosystem and is actually capable of turbocharging climate change itself, ultimately resulting in greater greenhouse gas emissions rather than less. Malaysia and Indonesia have seen a staggering loss of forest cover replaced by oil palm trees. These monoculture plantations drive the loss of tropical forest biodiversity. And that is not simply a problem for the orangutans, around whom such a notable campaign has been organized recently. It's a problem for the planet, as the planet loses all the ecosystem services that the forest provides, including carbon sequestration, climate regulation, soil stabilization, watershed protection, as well as the habitat and provisioning services. When these are factored in, the price of biofuel may appear very high indeed. The grain required to fill the tank of a Range Rover with ethanol is sufficient to feed one person in the developing world for an entire year. American ethanol from maize uses fossil fuel at every single stage of its production process, from fertilizer production to tractor harvest to processing and transportation to destination. It has been calculated that the growing of this maize for ethanol uses 30% more energy than the finished fuel itself produces. It also leaves eroded soil and polluted waters in its wake. Globally, the land cover under biofuel crops is projected to grow by 240% between 2005 and 2030. This has to be set against the rising demand for food crops as the planet's population rises from 6 towards 9.7 billion people by 2050. That is not just 50% more mouths to feed, but 50% more carbon footprints at a time when rising living standards for developing countries are seeing rising demand for less efficient meat over cereals. The Gallagher report, which the government commissioned, confidently predicts that there will be sufficient appropriate land available to meet both biofuel and agricultural food needs through to 2020. But very openly, very honestly, the Gallagher report also states that it has made no estimate of the likely conflicts of land use that may arise after that. I would suggest to the Minister that this is an important piece of research which must be commissioned urgently. We must ensure that credible, robust and widely accepted sustainability standards are put in place so that biofuel production does not lead to a net carbon debt, and so that land of high agricultural, food and biodiversity value does not experience conversion to biofuel production. Only if such standards are established can biofuels and biomass play an important and positive role in the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions and avoiding dangerous climate change. I now want to set out key policy proposals in the remainder of my speech and trust that in his reply, my very good friend, the Minister...
My friend a good way.
Of course, very happy to.
I'm very grateful. As my honourable friend moves on to proposals, I wonder if we consider one or 2 points. And first of all, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to pay tribute to the work that my honourable friend has done through the Global Organisation, both on biodiversity and on biofuels. And I wonder in his proposals whether we'd touch upon, one, the need to actually have some kind of assessment in relation to the impact on biodiversity of some of these crops. It's very important. Secondly, biofuels are never going to completely substitute for fossil-based fuels. And should there be some kind of targeting, like the aviation sector, for example, that has fewer options compared to the automobile sector? And 3, should not the subsidies be directed away from conventional crops in the way that they've distorted the market in the US and more towards second-generation biofuels, and in particular, the growing of biofuels in marginal land in developing countries?
Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted, although my right honourable friend intervened at some length. Every word of what he said was apposite, and I'm very grateful for his intervention and indeed his deep knowledge on this subject. I trust that the Minister, in his reply, will be able to indicate for each of the policy proposals that I put forward 3 things. First, does he accept that the proposal is correct? 2, will he indicate if it is or is not already government policy? And 3, where it is not, will he indicate whether he will endeavour to make it government policy? So, to the proposals. 1. The expansion of biofuel production should only occur where there is conclusive evidence of significant full life cycle CO2 reductions relative to fossil fuel comparators. The Minister will realise that if the land under cultivation has a high stock of carbon in the soil, or if existing vegetation is removed to enable biofuel planting, then there is a strong risk that carbon from the soil or pre-existing vegetation will be released into the atmosphere, offsetting any potential positive carbon reductions from the use of the biofuel product. Land where carbon stock cannot be compensated within a reasonable period by the GHG savings from use of the biofuel should not be converted to biofuel production. And in accordance with the EU Renewable Energy Directive, the calculation of emissions for greenhouse gas from biofuel production, EB, should account for all of the following: emissions from the extraction or cultivation of raw materials, including tillage and cultivation, the carbon cost of waste and leakage, and the production of chemicals or products used; annualized emissions from carbon stock changes caused by direct land use change; emissions from processing; emissions from transport and distribution, as well as the emissions from the biofuel when used. There should be subtracted from this any carbon capture and sequestration and or excess electricity from cogeneration, together with the proportion of emissions saved through co-products. These emissions should be compared against a fossil fuel comparator, EF, the net saving, if any, to be calculated as EF minus EB over EF times 100%. This will indicate an overall percentage greenhouse gas saving, and the biofuel in question should only be considered sustainable if the percentage saving is significant. Second proposal: expansion of biofuels should not come at the expense of food security or of land of high biodiversity and conservation value. To achieve this, land use planning, both in the UK and in developing nations, should be promoted so that account can be taken of the likely impact of land use changes upon food prices, particularly upon local indigenous communities. Third proposal: the government should work with stakeholders to create internationally recognised sustainability criteria that are credible, consistent, and independently certifiable. 4. Trade regulations and barriers should be reviewed so as to promote certified biofuels as a means of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and promoting economic development. Biofuels classified as agricultural goods are subject to high and sometimes punitive duty when exported into the US or EU, as well as other major markets. This distorts the market, stifles economic growth in developing countries, and perversely rewards those producing fuels that contribute to greater carbon emissions. This must stop. Finally, number 5. Considerable investment is required into research and development of the next generation of biofuels to improve the quality of feedstocks, research to reconcile anomalies between the End of Waste Directive and the environmental permitting regulations that govern the treatment of a biofuel manufactured from waste, research to develop soft cellulose-derived fuels and to improve the efficiency of conversion, This will require substantial investment. I ask my honourable friend, how much will the government commit? I am confident that my honourable friend will agree privately with all these 5 points in his own mind. If he can now formally agree with all 5 in his speech, Mr. Speaker, I will think that the future for biofuels and the future prospects of us avoiding dangerous climate change have come a little closer to being reconciled with feeding an expanding global population.